Matching nostril piercings. We're going to talk about doubles, sometimes they're called that. Sometimes they have a chain connected to it. What do you need before you get it done? We're going to talk about healing. We're going to talk about getting it done. And we're going to talk about some of the concerns about it and give you a few hints when you do go and get it done. In Consultations by a Piercer, episode number 23. For those that are new to the channel, first off, welcome to the Body Piercing and Tattooing channel. If you like videos that are educational about piercing and tattooing, you are in the right place, but you may not know who I am. My name is DaVo. I'm a professional body piercer and have been since 1994. I own and operate the Axiom Body Piercing Studio located right here in Des Moines, Iowa, inside Skin Kitchen Tattoo. So the piercings we're talking about today is a grouping, of course. It's two piercings on both sides of your nose. We usually try to do them so that they match. And look like they're part of, they belong there. Sometimes the latest trend or common trend is to put a chain that connects both of them, so you have this chain riding over the bridge of your nose. Healing time. Average healing time on these is roughly anywhere from 2 to 4 months, during which time I'm going to suggest cleaning twice a day using a sterile saline. I like NeilMed Piercing Aftercare, but if you can't find that or you don't have access to it, any good pharmacy or chemist, as they say in Europe, should have something that's comparable. The main things you want to look for is that it says sterile on the can, and when you turn it over and look at the ingredients, there's only water and sodium chloride, aka salt. There should be nothing else in there. The only difference maybe is how that is delivered. With the Piercing Aftercare from NeilMed, it comes out in a fine mist. A lot of the other ones, it comes out as a squirt gun. So if it comes out a fine mist, you just mist both sides, leave it alone. If it comes out in a stream, then you probably want to use a sterile piece of gauze sponge or a clean paper towel, apply it to the point where it's damp, and then lay it against the piercing for about 5 minutes. After you've done that, on either case, after it's had contact for that long, just pad the area, and that's it. The other thing I suggest doing is at the end of your shower, kind of pull your hair and everything out of the way and just let the water flow over the area for about 30 seconds. What we're trying to do with both of these things is we're trying to remove that hardened discharge from the jewelry. Your body will produce what's called limp discharge. It'll harden and collect on the jewelry throughout the healing period. The problem with having it on there is as the jewelry slides, shifts, moves, it can agitate the piercing and then lead to problems like bumps. So we want to try to remove that. Now, if you can't get it off there, or it seems like there's an obsessive amount of it, you may have some issues. And I would suggest seeing your piercer and having them clean it for you and have them take a look at it and see if there's something else going on. Now let's move on to the things you don't want to do, the cross-contamination prevention segment of this. Wash your hands before you handle it. No oral contact or exchange of bodily fluids on, near, around the piercing. Keep your environment clean. Clothing, bedding, towels, anything that comes in contact with the piercing needs to be cleaned on a regular basis. Do not submerge piercing in bodies of water you cannot control the quality of, which is pretty much everything but your own clean bathtub. I know people will say, oh, it's okay to swim after 2 weeks and all this other nonsense. The reality is any standing body of water is going to have microorganisms and pathogens in it, regardless of how well it's treated, no matter who swims in there, what have you. Every time you put that open wound, which is what a piercing is, in that water, there is a possibility of a foreign pathogen working its way into the piercing and causing an infection. It is best to wait until the piercings are completely healed. Now let's talk about trauma, pressure, and abuse. These are going to be more difficult because there's 2 of them to isolate. You want to avoid contact with things like your bedding, like don't sleep on them, don't put pressure on them. Sleep on your back or figure out a way to elevate the piercing off the bed. Avoid and be careful when you're removing and taking off clothing or anything that may have contact with the area. You do want to avoid or be very careful with. Do not spin, rotate, or move the piercing jewelry for any reason during the healing process. Don't play with it. Leave them alone. They are in the forbidden zone, never to be touched or played with until they're completely healed. Then you have the rest of your life to play with them. Now let's talk a little bit about jewelry. Most common, or what I would suggest for this particular piercing, is a threadless labrae stud. That's my #1 choice. Threaded, not generally an issue. You can also do this with nostril screws or L-bends. The problem with nostril screws and L-bends is usually they take up a lot more space inside your nose and they are not quite as secure. If you ended up with threaded jewelry, you do want to check the ends on a regular basis. I would say at least once a week to make sure that they're not coming unscrewed and falling off, because nothing sucks more than going through all the healing process and getting pierced and everything else and then have the ball fall off and you wake up in the morning, usually in the morning, and the jewelry's gone and the piercing's closed. You want to downsize this with labret studs in roughly 4 to 6 weeks. We put a longer post in there to allow for inflammation and swelling. There's no reason to leave it in there longer, and only leaving it in there, the longer piece in there past that 4 to 6 weeks period is just going to increase the likelihood of problems, because there's more movement, more chance of getting caught on things, etc. It can also agitate the tissue that's on your septum on the inside of your nose if it's pressing against it, if you have a small nostril cavity. One thing you are going to notice if you do both sides is one side is usually a little smaller than the other side. If you want to wear a chain or on this, or charms or anything else, you want to wait until the piercing is completely healed. Don't try to heal it out with a chain on there. It's just going to increase the likelihood of that piercing getting snagged, having additional weight and movement on the piercing, which could all lead to problems. The other problem is usually they're attached by O-rings or rings that are shaped like O's. I guess they're O-rings. Yeah, that's an O-ring. Right. Well, not the silicone kind. They're made of whatever material the chain is usually made of. And that can add a little extra agitation to the piercing, can also create another place for discharge and etc. to collect. So it's usually best to wait until it's completely healed, then switch out to the chains or put the chains on and let your piercer do it. Rings are possible, of course, but you want to wait a minimum of 6 months before you change out to that. And the main reason is you're going from a straight, solid, perfectly straight piercing to a curvature. This can cause agitation if you do this too quickly. We want to give your body time to season the piercing, to thicken up that tissue and kind of move or grow away from the jewelry a little bit and have more of an opening so it can handle that curvature. One thing I do want to mention here is if you are planning on wearing rings in these, I do mention that at the time of the piercing, especially when they're marking, because it's the ring always has to be large enough to wrap around the bottom. So unless you want extremely large rings or you're okay, or that's the style you're going for, if you want smaller ones, it needs to be lower on the nose, larger ones higher on the nose. So it's easier to plan this out ahead of time than to come back in 6 months and put a ring in and go, why is it so big? I don't like it so big. Now, pain. Usually with these, we're looking at something on a scale of 1 to 10, between a 2 and a 4, if 10 is the most painful. The second one may hurt more than the first one. That's pretty common with any type of piercing. The more you do of it, it's kind of like the first one you do, your body's like, hey, lady, or hey, bud, stop doing that. The second one, they're like, you need to stop doing that. The third one, they're like, we really need to stop doing this. Your pain registry goes up each time you have an additional piercing happen. So the first one, probably not too bad. Second one, probably a little bit more. Just to let you know that in advance. Probably not that much of a noticeable amount for most people, but it is a possibility. Plus, some people are more sensitive on one side or the other. Now, your eyes are gonna water. That's just part of getting anything done in the nose or on the nose. It doesn't mean you're a wimp. It doesn't mean you are a weakling or any other nonsense. It just means we did something in that area that makes your eyes water. You'll probably notice a little bit of slight throbbing and aching for about 2 to 3 minutes in some cases, and little or no bleeding, depending on what type of jewelry they use and how they do the piercing. These usually don't bleed a lot. Now let's talk about anatomy. Most people have the anatomy if they have a nose. There's really very few incidents other than maybe having a skin condition or some type of medical issue or what have you that would keep one from getting their nostril pierced. It's extremely rare that it would be turned away or you'd be told, hey, we can't pierce this. So you probably have a nose, you probably can get these piercings. Now, the angle of that piercing needs to match the anatomy so that the disc on the back or whatever jewelry's in there fits comfortably. You don't want this at a steep angle or an angle that doesn't sit right with the back. It needs to match that anatomy. Understand, nobody has a perfectly straight, perfectly matching nose. If you get out a ruler and measure one piercing and then measure the other one and notice there's a little bit of a difference, it's because there's a little bit of difference in your anatomy. We try to make these appear to match. It's more about that than it is about getting out, a level and trying to level them out and all this other stuff. Understand that it's not uncommon for these to be a little bit off, or if you look at them really closely, they're not quite exact. That's just because your anatomy is not exact. So do have that understanding going in. Now let's talk about placement. With the idea that you already understand that one side is going to be different than the other side, the way that I generally suggest marking these is with your chin down first so that you can match this way, and then look up and then match this way. When you're looking at these piercings in a mirror, after you get done, the piercer gets done marking them, insist they let you do that. You want to look at things kind of up close just to kind of get an idea of how each individual piercing is going to look, or kind of visualize it. And then you want to look at it at arm's length or further. And the reason being is that up close, they're going to look a lot less matching because you don't have as many points of reference. When you pull your hand out of that mirror away from you, you're going to have more points of reference, and it's going to look like it matches your body a little bit better. It's also not common for piercers to have you do various different facial expressions to kind of get an idea of how the jewelry is going to move on you and how that placement is going to shift or change. One thing I will tell you is most commonly when people come in and go, hey, somebody told me they don't match, or this one's off, or whatever, it's usually when people are very close to them and looking down. That's why it's important that it matches with your chin down. And when you look at them in the mirror, you should check both of those too. Other thing you need to take into consideration is if you have different gem settings or ends on one side or the other, it's going to make it seem more unmatched and less uniform. For example, if you have a 4mm bezeled gemstone on one side, and on the other side you have a flat titanium disc, it might make it look a little bit more this way or that way than it actually is, just basically because the ends are different. If you do notice that when you do wear exact jewelry and ends and everything, and it still looks a little bit off, one possibility is wearing a ring in one side and a stud in the other side. It will take away from that noticeable difference if you want to live with the piercing and not get it re-pierced. And finally, what you should consider. The first thing is I've gone through this already, is nobody is symmetrical. Nobody's face is perfectly matched and perfectly even. If it was, we would all look like aliens. We would look weird and strange, and not in a good way. If you don't believe me, there's plenty of apps that'll show you what that would look like. As I mentioned earlier, combining rings and studs can sometimes make the piercings, even if they're a little bit off, appear more to match than they do otherwise. If you are planning on stacking jewelry additionally, that can add another element to this to make them seem off. So take into account, if you have like a long-term master plan of what you want to do for piercings on your nose, talk to your piercer about it during the consultation, and maybe you can kind of map it out, take a picture with your cell phone of each side, and then you'll have a guide point to go by in the future. If you're involved in any type of sporting activity or anything that has a dress code, employed, etc., and it says in there that you can't have jewelry that's visible or jewelry beyond that isn't just a lobe piercing, you may want to consider waiting until you're done doing that before getting these piercings. It's not going to be a piercing that you can take out for long periods of time, especially in the first year or two, and not have problems getting it back in, or the constant taking the jewelry out, leaving it out for a little while, and putting it back in isn't going to cause issues. If you're in doubt or not unsure, talk to whoever's in charge, either your coach or manager or what have you, before you get the piercing done. The other thing is these piercings can't be hidden. Yes, you can buy clear retainers, glass retainers, that limit how easy it is to notice these, but if the person is close enough to you, they are going to notice it. So there's not really any way of hiding these piercings. I know if you go on the internet and search, there'll be about 8 million different ways you can hide it. Most of these aren't very practical and not good for long-term use, especially when healing a piercing. So do take that into account also. If you're planning on going on vacation or a business trip, I would advise waiting until after you're done with a vacation to get the piercing done, or to delay that trip. The main reason being is you're probably going to want to swim on that trip, and as I've already covered, that could lead to an infection. You're at a higher risk partly because you're in an environment that you have not ever been in possibly before. You may be exposed to some pathogens or microorganisms or fungi that you've never had any contact with before. You have an open wound, it gets in the open wound, and your immune system has not built up the immunity for it. So you're more acceptable to have issues with it. The other problem is that you cannot control how clean your bedding is, the environment you're in, etc. So it's usually best, plus it's a pain in the ass to deal with while you're traveling. So wait until you're done traveling or delay it until the piercing is healed. And lastly, because I like to always emphasize this, the biggest thing with these is not sleeping on them and isolating them, keeping things away from them. The more you isolate the piercing, the more you keep things away from it, the faster it's going to heal, the less likely you are to have issues. Well, that's it. That's all I have to say on that subject today. Till next time, here's hoping all your piercings heal with ease and without a single issue. And if you're in the Des Moines, Iowa area, I hope to see you for your piercing needs in the future. Have a good day. Thank you for watching. Check out this other video. You never know. Might be something you don't know yet.